Settling near the fireplace of her snug sod house, the pioneer woman cut up her warm calico dress. She sorted carefully through the pieces, deciding how to reuse each one. She set aside the largest, least worn remnants to make a dress for her younger daughter, then picked out a few threadbare scraps for cleaning rags. Finally, she stuffed the good, smaller pieces into her scrap bag. Fabric for clothing and bedding was scarce out west. Frontier women saved every scrap and devised creative ways to sew them together by hand. Someday, those pieces would reappear as a colorful patchwork quilt. As soon as her daughter was old enough to thread a needle and stitch a seam, the woman taught her to sew. By candlelight each evening, the girl worked on quilt tops for her hope chest. It was important for a young woman to bring a collection of quilts, clothing, and embroidered linens to her new home when she was married. Since there were few stores out on the prairie and money was scarce, she had to make the bedding for future family. Make the bedding her future family would need. Factory-made comforters were not even available until about 1890. Sorting through her scrap bag, the girl chose pieces of fabric and trimmed them neatly into squares, triangles, and strips. She laid the shapes on the table and shifted them around to form a colorful pattern. When she was satisfied with the design, she stitched the pieces together into a block. She sewed 5 to 9 blocks together in a row, then joined several rows to complete the quilt top. Inspired by the shapes and activities around them, early American quilters developed hundreds of wonderful patterns and gave them interesting names like log cabin, windmill, evening star, and bear tracks. If there weren't enough scraps to form well-ordered blocks, a frugal pioneer woman made a crazy quilt by sewing odd-shaped scraps in a random pattern onto a base, such as an old woolen blanket. She decorated the quilt with intricate embroidery along the seams, snips of ribbon and lace, and delicate embroidered flowers, animals, and people. Later, when the young woman announced her engagement, widely scattered neighbors gathered eagerly for an important social event, the quilting bee. The well-prepared country bride brought several tops she had pieced by hand, and her friends proudly displayed the friendship quilt top they'd brought as a wedding gift. Each contributor had made a block and embroidered it with her own initials. Together, the women began quilting. Quilting meant sewing separate layers of fabric together like a sandwich. The patchwork on top, the soft inner lining in the middle, and the backing, a large piece of seamless homespun cloth underneath to keep the layers taut so they could be sewn together easily. The quilters stretched them out and pinned them to wooden frames. The tiny quilting stitches joined all 3 layers, outlining the patchwork shapes. Usually, quilters stitched elaborate designs of leaves, feathers, hearts, and flowers, especially along the borders and in the corners. As the women skillfully worked in their fine, even stitches in and out across the quilt, they exchanged gossip, recipes, quilting patterns, and fabric scraps. Boys and girls too young to sew were paid pennies for keeping the needles threaded. By the end of the day, the quilts were finished. The men and older boys who had been helping the bride's father with farm chores returned, and everyone enjoyed a potluck supper, games, and dancing. The young couple could use their new quilts in many practical ways. Quilts could be hung from ceiling beams to divide cabins into rooms, tucked up in doorways and windows to keep out winter drafts, and spread out on the grass for picnics. Quilts could cover rough wood or dirt floors as mats for babies, and they could warm travelers on chilly winter rides in sleighs and wagons. Piled on the floor or on beds, quilts often served both as mattresses and as blankets. They were sold at bazaars to raise money for churches and schools. If a crop failed, a farmer might use a handsome homemade quilt to pay a debt. Pioneer women used their imaginations and the materials they had at hand to make warm and beautiful bedding for their families. At the same time, they created their own unique form of art, the American patchwork quilt.